and welcome to Better Done Than Perfect, a show for SaaS founders and product people. Our great guest today is Jordan Skoll, VP of Product Growth at Autobooks, and an amazing email automation expert. We're going to talk about different roles in the marketing, product, and email automation industry. This show is brought to you by Userlist, the best way for SaaS founders to send onboarding emails, segment your users based on events, and see where your customers get stuck in the product. Start your free trial today at userlist.com. Hey, Jordan.
Hi, Jane. How's it going?
Doing great. So excited to be talking to you again. After a while, we've talked at UI Breakfast about more abstract things, and now we're down to earth talking about email automation.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and you've had some fantastic guests on the show, so I'm very excited to be included.
For those who don't know who you are, tell us about your background story, and congratulations on your latest new title at Autobooks. Tell us more about that too.
Yeah, thanks. So my background is I've almost always worked in the marketing automation space, email automation space. I got started working for a referral software company called Ambassador. I was the fourth employee there, and there was a lot of marketing automation as a part of that. That company went on to exit. I also started my own software company, went through a couple of accelerators, and then eventually left that. I was the campus director for a code school for a period of time and learned a lot about mentorship and some of the soft skills through that experience. Oh, and then of course I went to ActiveCampaign, where I built and maintained their automation. So I was an early employee at ActiveCampaign. I was with them. I left around 350th employees when I decided to leave, and I was basically in charge of building and running ActiveCampaigns. I was the internal user. I used ActiveCampaign at ActiveCampaign.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. You don't not only have internal knowledge, like insider knowledge about how the company operates, but you've also been setting up using ActiveCampaign for their own product growth. This is really superb.
Yeah, so I did that for a little while, and then my wife and I wanted to come back to Detroit, where I'm from, and so I got a job at a really, really awesome, amazing fintech called Autobooks, and that's where I've been for the past 3 years.
For the context, tell us more about Autobooks, what they do and what you do for them.
Yeah, so Autobooks, one of the things that attracted me to Autobooks was the challenge. It's not a typical SaaS model in the market. Autobooks licenses get paid software, invoicing software, and we have another tool called a payment form. We license that software to banks, and banks white label us and embed us inside of their internet banking platform. So if you have a bank account with one of our partners and an internet bank account with one of our partners, you're able to log in to your internet banking and send your customers an invoice or request payment as easily as just texting a link to them. And this is just native. This feels like native functionality inside of our partners' bank accounts. What's really interesting about that is sort of like a Stripe model. We get paid across when money runs across the rails, what the industry calls TPV. And so we make some money by selling and licensing to the banks directly, but a large portion of our revenue comes from utilization of the product. And so that's what my team is in charge of, is driving adoption into the bank's customer base. So I like to say that I am the bank's product marketer for this feature. And then, of course, within Autobooks, we have additional features. So it's a really interesting challenge because every single bank comes with its own sort of rules and feelings and brand guidelines and everything else under the sun. And my job is to use what I have available to try and drive adoption into their customer base.
As a product person, do you have direct access to the bank's customer base? Do you get to talk to them?
I do, and I often will send product marketing emails. I'll use email marketing software as the bank on behalf of the bank. So we're almost like an agency in that regard, where we connect to the bank and we help craft emails that will drive Autobooks adoption. or adoption of our plugins or our modules. And we send those emails to the customer base. So there's two sales that really need to take place. The first sale is with the bank itself to allow us the permission to do so, to earn their trust, because banks' most valuable commodity is trust that their customers trust them. And so we have to be very careful with that trust. The second sale is to the small businesses themselves to let them know about the feature and to start using the feature.
We decided to discuss today an amazing variety of roles that's happening in, the marketing/product/growth department. And a lot of them are related to automation. So maybe you could start by elaborating what your title means. You're VP of Product Growth. You're not VP of Product, you're not VP of Marketing, but Product Growth. What does that mean for your company?
So there's a word that the industry likes to, lately the word has been CX, or customer experience, or customer experience design. While I recognize the need to differentiate from UX has its own set of problems, which is UX and UI is often conflated, and people don't really understand the role of a UX designer, and they will often think that a UI designer is a UX designer. The way I feel about it is really what we call CX is just UX. And what I mean by that is the user's experience is not limited only to the interface. In fact, oftentimes we should strive to stretch the experience beyond the interface. So anytime that a customer or a user is interacting with you or your product, whether it's in the interface or not, that is part of their experience. And actually the experience, the sort of non-digital experience leading up to engaging with your product as well, is also part of that experience. So we design experiences that range from an interaction with the bank teller to direct mail to email to first touch with the interface and onboarding within the interface itself. And we're actually currently working on products where other people, bank tellers or our sales staff, can onboard the user as well. So we're sort of in this place right now where, because we're a software product, if one of our sort of outbound sales staff calls, and those are triggered calls as well, those sales interactions are based on behavioral signals. If one of those outbound calls resonates and a user wants to sign up, we're talking about small businesses that are riding around in their pickup trucks, fixing HVAC and things like that. And so you can imagine, not only is it bad for business, but it's a bad experience for the customer to say, okay, great, now pull out your laptop and go through this onboarding. And it's much easier to say, okay, let me just enter your information and get your account provisioned over the phone. And so CX, UX, whatever we want to call it, it is just experience design. And so we are playing with that. And the way Autobooks is organized is we're all under my boss and mentor, Chris Speck. And I work incredibly close with our director of product, who's in charge of building the interface. And our team has built and designed interface as well, particularly around onboarding. And so when we design the interface, we make sure to design the emails that correspond with the activities taking place in the interface. So this concept, this software concept of almost like a walled garden, I'd like to challenge that. I'd like to disrupt that. And sort of going even further, we're currently working on a product right now for our bank tellers to prompt our partners, our bank, third-party people at the bank, to reach out when certain activities have taken place inside a user's account, that we plan on not developing a true interface at all. We plan on running the entire experience out of email. And I've written a couple of articles at ActiveCampaign on the topic, and I think they're still up on the blog. But the idea being is that like, why not prompt the user? Why not bring the interface inside of the email and give them what they want there? There's a lot of ego in my mind wrapped up in trying to drive somebody into your app to get them to solve a problem that they're facing. So that's where my head's at these days. It's wild. And I think the word we're saying is CX, but I think when you think of typical CX, it still draws a harsh boundary between UX and CX. There's still distinct functions, and the whole idea is to blur that, to muddy that. Let's make that a little bit more on the center of the pendulum and design the entire experience.
Email is a pretty weird thing. Anyways, it's kind of ephemeral because it exists in customers' inboxes, not anywhere in your own, system. And it's an artifact. It can be designed, can be written, but it just like vaguely exists all around, and it's behavior triggered, which makes it even more abstract. Do you think it's a part of product or part of marketing communications? What is it? Where does email automation belong?
I don't know where it belongs. Where I think it should belong and where it does belong, I think is interesting. You'll see this, right? Where the engineering team has developed the transactional system for products, typically in SaaS or in software. And then the marketing team is responsible for another set of emails that sort of start with broadcast emails at the fundamental and move towards behaviorally triggered emails. And those two systems don't talk to each other very well. Even at Autobooks, for example, where you can imagine the product in a lot of ways, an invoice is an email. So a lot of that system lives sort of deep within our engineering team and is not very accessible. And yet that's some of the most common touch points, the most common interactions between our customers and the software is within those emails. And so there's a lot of opportunity to tap into that, to understand what's going on in the user's world the moment that they're sending in an invoice, the moment they get paid, for example, for us, when an invoice is paid, for our customers, our merchants' customers, when they receive either a receipt or an invoice. So oftentimes I think that it gets sort of buried inside of companies. And that's a shame, because I really think that there's so much opportunity inside of those emails, inside of those touch points.
When you work on customer experience, what is your source of truth? How do you represent this, interaction system, that is the result of your work and also work in progress? Is it a giant chart with different emails as endpoints? Where does the email copy get stored? How do you represent all those relationships?
Wow. Oh man, that's a great question. Wow, that's such a good question. So you're like really striking at the heart of a project that we're working on right now. And this is why I love where I work. Is this isn't necessarily a challenge, as much of a challenge, but I think that this challenge can lead best practices in the industry. So the challenge is that we essentially have workflows, for the audience that's familiar with marketing automation. We have workflows, and we need to pitch those workflows to an outside third party. So they're relatively standard. We know what copy works. We are a jobs to be done shop. Chris is the founder of Rewired Group, worked with Bob Mesta, who might be the living authority, the best living authority on jobs to be done these days. And so we've heavily researched the copy that goes into our emails. We've heavily designed the interactions. So understanding not just guessing at a behavioral trigger, but really researching and digging into the prompts. Like what are the leading indicators that we know somebody is dealing with a struggle that our software solves? And we have mountains of data to tap into that. And the challenge comes from not having a system that is effective in the fintech industry, world-class at driving that adoption, but actually at partnering with banks who marketing means something very different to them than it does to us. And introducing this sort of new way, this behavioral automation system where not every user has the same experience, but in fact, I really strive hard to make sure that no two users have the exact same experience. And that can be sometimes a pretty gnarly concept to convey to somebody. And so what ends up happening for us is first there's the two sales. So the first sale is on marketing automation in general inside of these large industrious organizations. and with lots of bureaucratic red tape and regulations as well. But how do we also continue to iterate on our product? So I envy my old world where if you wanted to make a change, you make a change. Maybe you have to convince your boss, you make a change, that kind of thing. But for me, I actually have to go convince the next bank of the next version. And what happens is we end up getting stuck. So we call the whole package the artifact that we produce and present to our banking partners, the playbook. So I might use that term. And it's almost like an instruction manual for how everything works together in text. But as you can imagine, if that artifact lives in something like a PDF or a Word document, it's slow to change. So as we are working on the system and developing the system and iterating on the system, that needs to be reflected back down to the playbook so that the next bank we sign, once something catches, we can sort of sell it to them. Or perhaps like, we sign a bank, we run playbook A, or let's call it V1. And then the next bank we run V1.1. And actually that was not a good experiment. It doesn't work very well. So the next bank we do, we sort of remove what we put in V1.1 and we're on to we're back to V1 perhaps, or maybe we're on to V1.2. And so that system of iterating, of managing versions of the system is really fun for me because in marketing automation, I got my start similar to Brennan and I think perhaps similar to some of your other guests that you might have on the engineering side. So understanding, looking at these systems as sort of some of the low code so hot these days, but marketing automation has been low code or visual code for quite some time now. And being able to look at these systems from an engineering perspective and say, hey, you know what? Like we have something like there's solved problems on this. We have like CI/CD on the engineering side. Where's the CI/CD of deploying a CX system or a marketing automation system? And so we're having to design not just the experiences themselves, not just the production, but also the metadata that goes along with the system in a way that is easily consumable and our banking partners can understand. Essentially, automated documentation for our process. Which one pushes first is sort of one of the challenge. Do we introspect the automations and use that to generate? Or do we actually write the documentation and then that pushes it up to the automation system? So the two mental models that I'm thinking through in my head are the first one is from a DevOps perspective. So, infrastructure as code. If you wanted to deploy, there's tools out there like serverless and I think both Azure and AWS have a way to provision machines in the cloud using code files. And so that model exists from the documentation building, describing the system we want. And then on the other side, we have, there's a lot of self-documenting libraries where you can write code and that code will self-document itself. And so documentation stays up to date. And so we're playing with those mental models right now. And it's really fun because I really feel like we are in a place, Autobooks in particular, and our very small, very nimble, whatever I'm going to call it, CX design team, where we're developing the future of this industry. And it's from a best practices perspective. And it's really nerdy. It's like far, far on the engineering side. I don't think it's applicable for most marketing automation users, certainly the customers at ActiveCampaign, or I would call them perhaps maybe the median customer at ActiveCampaign. It's not beneficial for, but I sort of forecast, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it's going to be pretty normal. So
we've talked about your Autobooks projects before, and you've worked with consultants, if I'm right, to develop the copy and what needs to be delivered. And then you use your automation skills to make sure it's delivered on time and properly implemented. So what is that breakdown between a few stages that we've been able to identify? For example, research, copywriting, then goes the actual implementation stage, and then there are engineers who make sure it integrates well in terms of data. What is that breakdown from your experience?
Oh, that's such a good question too. It all starts with the jobs to be done research, understanding our customers and what prompts them. And then we have hired several conversion copywriters, which I think if you have for your listeners, go hire a conversion copywriter, go work with a conversion copywriter, listen to what they say. Don't try and fight what you might view as normal. They are fantastic. And we've had the opportunity to work with some of the best in the world. So we worked with Claire Solentrop, who I believe is a co-founder of UserList as well. And we worked with Val, who is now heading up, I believe she's heading up research at Klaviyo, and Ali Blum as well, who is fantastic and phenomenal and cannot recommend highly enough. But please don't poach her from me.
You just named our most favorite 3 people in the world, so that's great.
Yeah. And what we actually then worked on was developing a accelerated curriculum for on-ramping conversion copywriters directly out of Joanna's Copy Hackers Code School as well. So we actually reached out to Joanna and were able to take and hire 2 copywriters right out of Code School and put them through an accelerated 2-week course that Ali and I designed to get them up to speed on jobs in a very accelerated way. And that's important because I think jobs is very confused. People don't really understand it. There is not a lot of actual writing out there on the how-to of how jobs works, and people misunderstand the empirical nature of jobs. And I won't go too deep on that topic. I could probably rant about that for quite some time, but we then take the jobs and the conversion copywriting, and we show how conversion copywriting, or what we're actually starting to rebrand as communication frameworks, because the banks, it's much more palatable for the banks. And I actually think it's perhaps a better positioning for conversion copywriting in general, but how the communication frameworks are the applied research, the research applied, and our conversion copywriters. And the reason I say that they're sort of misunderstood is because they really function as our CX architects. And I'm actually currently playing with the idea of retitling their role as CX architect, meaning they're the designers of the system, and they might design something. They might design the experiences in a mural or a Miro or something like that. So yeah, we're currently considering retitling. I'm currently considering retitling them as CX architects because they design the experience that they want to see happen, just like a product designer might design product or in a low fidelity way, hand that off to a designer and an engineering team to actually bring that sort of concept to a reality. Our CX architects do the same thing. So they design not just the copy. They don't just write the copy, but they also say, like, when this happens, this happens. And we'll mock that up in a mural. And then that comes down to another team which is in charge of implementing, but either implementing that or satisfying the requirements. So one of the things I like to tell our copywriting team, our CX architect team, is that just stop. Like, don't ask me what's possible. Tell me what you want to have happen, and I'll go figure out how to make it happen. If there's data that you need, if there's a trigger that you need that's not getting passed through, let's de-risk that. But don't assume anything less than ideal, right? Let's present ideal. And then it's on the sort of CX engineering team, what I'm considering calling CX engineering or something like that, to then either pull the data through our ETL jobs, which is really true data engineering, and or wire it up in the email system. And I'm using email broadly because we run, at this point, we run direct mail and phone calls and everything else out of there. But as far as designing the workflow, we will make sure to accomplish that. The same way that an engineer, it's on the engineer to figure out how to get it done. So it's really interesting because I'm sort of thinking out loud live with you here. We're kind of in the right now, smack dab in the middle of a transition. My org used to be separated by adoption team and an activation team. And people were responsible for those 2 numbers. And underneath them was sort of a team of people. We might get back to that again, but we're considering having more of a floating model now, where we have these CX architects, which are tasked with a short-term project go fix adoption in this circumstance. And they will design a system that is meant to drive more adoption and pass that down to the CX engineers to make sure that that becomes a reality. And we'll see how it goes. It's whether it happens exactly like that or not is to be determined, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it right now. So we have a saying at Autobooks, copy leads design, which does not pass any judgment on anything. It's just an order of operations, where most typical companies will design an interface, fill it with lorem ipsum, and then bring somebody in to make the lorem ipsum appropriate for those boxes, like a Mad Libs. Whereas at Autobooks, what we do is we write the copy and then we hand it to the designer, and then the designer figures out how to fit the copy in a way that is intuitive and aesthetically, pleasing, conveys the visual communication style to support the words. And so it's kind of like that, only from experience design perspective. We design the experience first, and then we implement the designed experience.
I'm glad that you adjusted the title from conversion copywriters to CX architects, because none of these amazing consultants don't call themselves copywriters, and they haven't for ages. They're email marketing strategists or whatever not, but it's such a wide profile job, really. The ultimate deliverable often is copy, but it's so much that informs it. The research drives copy, then copy drives design, and then design drives implementation. Is that the flow that you adhere to?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And the copywriters and the CX architects, context is so important for them. They want it. You can't just write something that fits for everybody, And so one of the communication frameworks we talk about is the rule of one, which is like one reader, one offer, one promise, all under the concept of one big idea, right? And so as soon as you start writing for everybody, you start writing for nobody. And we talk about, the mental model we like to use is being at a train station, PA's going all day long, you don't hear anything. And then as soon as they say, your name, Jordan or Jane, you instantly hear it. And we want our emails to feel like that. We want our emails to land like somebody saying your name at a busy train station. And that only happens when they say your name, when they're talking about the things that you care about. And so getting that and designing that one-to-one interaction, that's what they do. And they don't design sort of something for everybody. And so in order to make that happen, when you work with them, you learn it. They bring in all these other things. When this happens, this happens. When this happens, this happens. And they're so thoughtful. They're so empathetic. Every single one that I've worked with, and now our team is as well, that we're sort of letting them figure that part out. And then like a product role, truly like a product role, and then figuring out how to just make it happen for them. So all three of them, Claire, Val, and Allie, I said when they came in, because this was kind of an unfamiliar thing, I said, just think of it as a genie. Think of it as like a magic genie. Like I'll figure out, don't ask me questions. I'll figure out how to make it happen. Like there's a way to figure it out every single time if you're willing to invest. And, fortunately at Autobooks, we have the support and the backing and, at the executive and leadership level to invest in getting this right. And it pays dividends.
Just to make sure I understand, the architects / copywriters, they wrote emails that were then used to create sequences for each of the banks you work with. Is that correct? Because every bank has their own tone of voice guidelines, etc. So I wonder how you mix your jobs to be done research and the product adoption story with their own voice of customer guidelines and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's great. It's a challenge because I'm reselling long copy, long text-based wordy copy over and over and over again to an industry that is completely unfamiliar with long copy. And unfortunately, people don't understand the difference between long copy and effective copy or specific copy. And so I have to say over and over again, it doesn't work because it's long. Length has nothing to do with anything. Like that's not a desired outcome. It's not like writing an essay when you're in school and you have to hit 8,000 words and you're done and you cram it full of a bunch of gibberish. That's not it. Like we write long copy. We sometimes write short copy. It's just that length is not sort of a criteria. And when you write long copy well, you will find people, and we have to show this a lot of times, coming back and opening and opening and opening and opening and referencing the same email again and again. And, we have customer testimonials about how this email, they can point to these emails and they can say, this email, not this email is why I adopted Autobooks. This email changed my life. I mean, we have customer testimonial. It's an incredible story from this woman. I won't share the details, but her story reads like a Lifetime movie. And, she says that she was praying every day for a solution to everything that was going on in her life. And she thinks that it had to do with, divine intervention, why she got this email. And really, I don't want to break it to her. I don't know, this gets into some weird topics, but we researched it. It comes from research. It comes from understanding her struggle and knowing that other people struggle, not with her exact situation, but with things like that, where all of a sudden something changes. Life got too chaotic and became out of control and very difficult for her to manage. And she needed a way to get her invoicing and billing under control. And we see that fairly common. It's one of our 4 job types. And so writing an email for that situation, targeting that exactly what she's going through with the right level of fidelity. So that's important as well. Talking about the chaos, but not talking about not going too far into the specifics of the chaos, or possibly telling a story for somebody that would resonate with her, where she can see herself in the story, is really, really powerful. So we have to do that. We have to sell that over and over and over again to these banks. And it is a challenge, but we always remind them that what we say is, we ask you to adopt our brief, not our copy. And so what we've started doing is putting together a very verbose brief, a very verbose outline document that goes into what the email is about and what the objectives of the email are. And we cite it. And we typically use up to 18 pieces of VOC, cited VOC, which link back to larger customer testimonials to support the empirical nature of this email. And then we say, we can write it, we can modify it however you'd like, so long as it doesn't violate the brief. So oftentimes they are concerned about brand voice and tone, but those two things don't need to be exclusive of each other.
You've touched on jobs to be done multiple times today, and you decided not to go into that. And there are many great resources, but what are your favorite where our listeners can go and, educate themselves about how jobs to be done work, particularly for emails?
Wow, particularly for emails.
Well, that's probably too big of an ask. Just regular jobs to be done resources would also be great.
Yeah, so I would follow Bob Mesta on the internet. I would try and listen to as many podcasts as you can that he's in as well. So one book that I would recommend is Demand Side Sales. I think that's Bob's most recent book, and it's an interesting take on jobs to be done. It's far more applied than normal, I think. I think he's starting to relabel jobs to be done. I think just some of the language around jobs to be done just becomes a little bit confusing, and some of the milkshake, everybody knows Clayton Christensen's, or once you start getting into jobs, one of the first things you'll encounter is Clayton Christensen's milkshake example. And I think that one is not as strong of an example. It's actually not really one of my favorites. And I think it can lead folks a little bit astray. So I would do those things. So my boss, Chris, has a website, and he has a couple of recordings of interviews. So one of the most helpful things is to understand and listen to real examples of jobs interviews to understand how they are sort of different. So that kind of leads me into my favorite way of looking at jobs is not through the jobs lens at all, but actually through a storytelling lens. A fantastic world to dive into on Wikipedia and YouTube is Joseph Campbell and the Hero's Journey. And it's sometimes referred to as the monomyth. And once you start scratching at that surface, once you feel like you understand sort of Joseph Campbell and the monomyth, go rent, download, stream, 12 Pixar movies. And every Pixar movie follows the monomyth almost exactly. And it will just blow your mind as soon as you start to recognize this storytelling pattern. And once you recognize that storytelling pattern, it helps for me, it was what was able to help me reverse engineer Jobs, because a core concept of Jobs is the push. And the push has nothing to do with your product. It has everything to do with what's going on in the user's life. I won't spoil the exercise for folks, but there's something that happens in all of these movies and in a lot of classic stories as well that forces the hero out of their normal life and onto an adventure. And that is what Jobs describes. It is that force that is pushing the hero out. So I said I wasn't going to spoil it. I'll just do Moana real quick. So you can break Moana down using Jobs very classically. She feels this pull towards the ocean. She feels this pull to a different way of life, but that's not what actually gets her off her island. It's not what gets her sort of into the special world. It isn't until her island's crops, the coconut trees, start to become diseased and they start running out of food, that environmental factor, that change in her sort of normal life, forces her off the island to go in search of a better
the green
way.
stone, whatever that was.
The green stone, yeah. I don't like go too deep into it. The boon, in the monomyth, you might call it a boon. And so in all of our users' lives, we focus on, oh, the ocean's so great. We have such a great ocean. It's so blue. And we tend to ignore the fact that the reason people enter our special worlds, they ask for our help and guidance, is because there's something that has changed in their life, It's changed in their life that has pushed them out of their status quo, out of their habits, out of their comfort zone. And that's what you're addressing. That's what the job is. So it has nothing to do with your product at all. It has to do with what prompts them to make a change.
Thanks so much for joining us today. I wish we could talk for another hour about this. 2 short tips for our listeners. 1 do and 1 don't when it comes to email automation from your 10,000 feet professional view.
My number 1 do would be to start. We've gone pretty deep on some pretty advanced 401 level marketing automation concepts, and not everybody might be there, and that's okay. So if you're listening to this, if you want to get off of the cycle of weekly chores, then go back and listen to Brennan's episode. He talks about what he calls a shadow newsletter. Go build a shadow newsletter. It's the first place to start. And it's the most fantastic thing that you can do. It'll really change your life. And you can change the order of the emails every single week. And you can sit down and you can write 4 emails or 8 emails and add them to your shadow newsletter. And so if you're working with broadcast emails, you're on this cycle of having to craft an email every week, constantly scurrying around last second, trying to get it out, worried about, you're supposed to send on Wednesday morning and slipping into Wednesday afternoon and can't miss Thursday. We've all been there. Just stop doing that. Go do the shadow newsletter thing and just start bolting newsletters on to the end of it. There's a trick to that, which is that you need to write evergreen content. You need to write content that will work just as well next week or in 3 months as it works this week. I have a guess that that's what you're doing anyways. So go do that. And if you have a shadow newsletter, if you're already done that and you've taken that first step, the next thing to do is start mapping out behavioral triggers. Start looking at behavioral triggers and start designing those interactions. So I'm getting a little long-winded, but there's 2 sort of behavioral triggers that you can do. One is proactive behavioral messaging, where you're trying to get somebody to do something, and then you stop doing it. You stop messaging them once they complete that action. And then the second one is reactive behavioral messaging, whereas as soon as somebody does something, you respond with an email. So if you are working in SaaS, probably the latter is easier to implement. So just go write a message. Anytime somebody activates a feature, a key feature that you want them to activate, follow up with a message or 2 or 3 that teach them how to use it and where to get help if they get stuck. Do one, whichever stage you're at, do one of those two things. Go do it. You can implement it today. You can be done by the end of the week. And so go do that right away and win some of that time back so that you can start making bigger investments in the future. My don't make users authenticate into your app to unsubscribe. That's my don't. That's just,
yes.
just don't do that. You kick people off your list that don't want to be on your list. You're not doing anything to yourself by keeping people who don't want to be engaged around. Don't spam your customers. Don't get the thought out of your mind that, well, what if all it's doing is hurting your open rates, your deliverability for folks that want to receive your communication. So just kick them out. Be aggressive with it if you want. Kick people out. If they're not even opening your emails, kick them out. We auto suppress everybody. If they don't want to hear from us, I don't want to be sending to them. So
great advice. Where can people find more of your doings online?
Yeah, they can follow me on Twitter. That's probably where I'm the most active. I'm at Jordan Skole, Skole. And if they want to read some of my writing, which is almost always 75% complete, I am happy to share those drafts with them and am constantly looking for feedback for clarity and those other things. So, feel free to send me a message on Twitter.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing your insights today, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Awesome. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks for listening. If you found the episode useful, please spread the word about this new show on Twitter, mentioning Userlist, or leave us a review on iTunes.